Good day. Today is Thursday, 3rd April 2025, and of course today is the day after Liberation Day in the United States, the announcement by President Donald Trump himself of sweeping tariffs affecting most of the world, most of the countries in the world, 10% flat tariffs on many countries, but higher tariffs on various others. Well, there has been vast amounts of discussion and debate about this, and there's been a lot of discussion about the economic effects of these tariffs, with many people, many commentators, writers, economists, all predicting that the economic effects of these tariffs will be very grave and that they will deepen the recession, the global recession, of which we can already see telltale signs beginning to appear, and which I suspect was coming regardless of whether these tariffs had been imposed or not. I'm not going to discuss the economic effects of these tariffs in this program. We are going to have programs about this on the Duran. We're hoping to speak to various economists and people of that kind, and we will be discussing the effect of these tariffs in more detail in those programs. Here, I want to talk about the motivations, some of the geopolitical consequences, and perhaps what they tell us about the direction that Donald Trump wishes to take America, and about the overall message it gives us about America itself and where it is heading. And here I think the most important point for me to make is that a lot of the commentary that I have been reading makes the very strange, to my mind, almost perverse presumption that before these tariffs were imposed, before Donald Trump was elected President of the United States, everything in the United States, in the US economy was well. Things were well, the economy was growing. It was, in the United States, the best of all possible worlds. A good example of this type of commentary, though you will find it in many places, is an article by Edward Luce in the Financial Times. Its title is 10 Weeks That Shook the World, and it reads this: Donald Trump was sworn in 10 weeks ago. He inherited an economy with stable inflation and dropping interest rates, but with growth still projected to outstrip any big competitor this year. With each fresh Trump salvo on the global economy, US growth forecasts are cut, assuming he will supply more fuel for downward revisions, most likely with his Liberation Day of reciprocal tariffs on the rest of the world. America seems bound for recession this year. This would be a recession of choice, Trump's choice. So all was well, and then along came Donald Trump, an ignoramus, somebody who doesn't understand economics, who has no real feeling for what's really going on in the United States, who's full of all kinds of assumptions and presumptions about things and biases, all of which supposedly are irrational, are not fact-based. And he comes along and he takes this wonderful situation which he's inherited, and he imposes these tariffs and he messes everything up. I don't think that is entirely an exaggerated way of describing a lot of the commentary that we've seen. So going back to Edward Luce, Trump inherited an economy with stable inflation, dropping interest rates, and growth still projected to outstrip any big competitor this year. And this is, of course, completely in line with much of the commentary about the state of the US economy throughout the period of Biden's presidency. We were reading all the time all kinds of people saying that growth in the United States was very strong, that the United States was surpassing Europe, surpassing all of the other major economies, that Americans just didn't understand how well off they were. There was all this grumbling, but it was not based on the realities of the situation that Americans found themselves in, where things were better, were good, and was only getting better. Now, I have to say that I think that this is a completely wrong picture of the state of the United States as it was 10 weeks ago before Donald Trump became president. In fact, I would say that the United States, on the contrary, was on a completely unsustainable trajectory. It was running massive budget deficits. It was running massive trade deficits. Money was being constantly diverted into extraordinary military spending on a scale unmatched by any other country in the world, indeed by any other country in history. There was rampant tax evasion right across the United States. In fact, people don't want to discuss, but it's true. There was a growing inequality in the United States. The Biden era had been distinguished by falls in real wages, which has been a real problem in the United States for many decades, but they got particularly acute during the period of the Biden administration. In 2022, real inflation was apparently above 10%. We've never been given truly satisfactory figures. I seem to remember that Larry Summers, former US Treasury Secretary, at one point actually said that by his guesstimate, inflation in the United States in 2022 might have been as high as 18%, well above the figures that were being officially published. And the Biden administration was spending huge sums of money. It was running, as I said, massive fiscal deficits. It talked about running the economy hot. It seemed to be seeking some great surge of economic growth. There were plans to spend the money on infrastructure, to rebuild the US's semiconductor industry, the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and all of those things. But all that spending on infrastructure delivered very little. The factories, in the end, that were supposed to produce the chips were either never built, or when they were built, they didn't produce many chips. All kinds of things in the economy were going wrong, and the overall story was of deficits, of rising debt levels, debt growing at the rate of $1 trillion every 3 months, and of a situation which, as I said, to me looked frankly unsustainable. And all of this, even as manufacturing and economic dynamism and growing productivity was taking place in other countries. China has, for some time now, overtaken the United States as a manufacturing power, as the major exporter of finished goods, and doing so with much more well-run finances. I know this is something that many people dispute, but that is the reality, and that was also the case elsewhere. And it seems to me, and I don't think I'm alone in this, that what was happening in the United States is that economic policy was being run around foreign policy priorities. beating back the Russians and the Chinese, maintaining the United States' preeminent position in world affairs, getting into conflicts with Russia. We now know the extent of the United States' intervention in the war in Ukraine and the incredible, reckless risks the United States was taking. And even some of the attempts to get, the economy moving faster that we saw over the course of the Biden administration, the period of trying to run the economy hot, though it's never perhaps straightforwardly acknowledged. Much of it ultimately was about trying to compete with China, trying to run economic growth in the United States at something like Chinese levels, and doing so through a massive spending program, investment program as it was called, in the United States, which, since it was not planned properly, did not really look at the capacity constraints, inevitably led to higher inflation. So that is the backdrop against which Donald Trump was elected president. And of course, the Biden approach was basically a more extreme version of the approach to economic policy that has been run in the United States for many decades. A quest to sustain American primacy in ways that ultimately weakened the position of the heartland, the industrial manufacturing economy, the real economy of the United States, the one in which most Americans live their lives. And what eventually happened is that people became tired, and they already showed that they were becoming increasingly disenchanted with this in 2016, with the election that took place then. And they became even more clear-cut about that in last year, in 2024. And that was why Donald Trump was re-elected president in November 2024. Because most Americans have been under growing levels of stress and economic pressure. They're becoming disenchanted with the demands that are being endlessly made on them and on the economy by an out-of-touch political class in Washington. And perhaps with not a huge amount of conviction, they nonetheless said to themselves, well, Donald Trump looks different. He talks a different narrative, a different story. He seems to be much more interested and concerned about our lives, and he perhaps will come in and he will do things differently. And that is why Trump was elected, and that is why he's trying to do what he is doing now. And to say it straightforwardly, it is being done in an extraordinarily confused and chaotic way. Take, for example, the back of the envelope way in which the tariffs other countries are supposed to impose on the United States are calculated. Now, it should be said straight away that there are many, many countries around the world, the European Union, China, all kinds of countries which do impose restrictions on imports from the United States, which are invisible. There are all kinds of regulatory mechanisms, attempts to find all kinds of reasons not to allow goods from the United States or the outside world to come in and to compete in the economies of these countries on an equal basis with the goods produced in those countries themselves. Of course, this goes on. I suspect every country in the world, every big industrial country in the world does it to a greater or lesser degree. The United States does it too, by the way, as I happen to know. It is far from easy, for example, to sell certain industrial products in the United States. Again, all kinds of regulatory obstacles and that sort of thing are imposed to prevent it happening. I'm not saying that the United States does this more than other countries. Perhaps it does it less than other countries. All I am saying is that everybody does it. Now, having said that, the administration, Donald Trump, the people around him, don't seem to have done any proper analysis of how this is being done around the world. At least if they have, I've seen no evidence of it. And they've come up with all of these figures for the kind of restrictions on American trade which they say these other countries are applying upon the United States. And they then come up with some kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation to translate this into tariffs. And then they say that the tariffs that the United States is slapping on these countries above the 10% tariff, that these are somehow reciprocal tariffs intended to retaliate against these unfair trade practices practiced by these countries. I mean, it is unbelievably crude. But the point to make here is that it has no clear foreign policy purpose. It is not done, as I think many people will claim, for any visible or coherent geostrategic purpose. To give an example, one of the countries that has been most savagely punished, I suspect to its own horror and astonishment, by this sudden announcement of tariffs is Vietnam, which is now finding that the goods it sells to the United States are, from memory, I think around 45% of value, far above that of other countries and above China, by the way, where the tariffs are set at 34% of the value of goods. Now, Vietnam has had recently relatively good relations with the United States. Moreover, the United States, during the Biden era, and to some extent even during the Trump era, has been trying to win over Vietnam to make it an ally against China, on the theory that Vietnam and China have a long, difficult history of antagonism with each other. By the way, I disagree with that historical view, but never mind. Anyway, the idea is that Vietnam has this long antipathy towards China, and it is therefore a natural ally of the United States. So the United States has been making a big effort to try to win over Vietnam, and the Vietnamese have never completely shut the door. And now they find that despite that, the United States is imposing these savage tariffs upon them, which, to say it straightforwardly, are going to affect the Vietnamese economy very badly, because Vietnam's economy has been expanding and expanding rapidly, partly through export of goods to the United States. Another country that must be feeling very aggrieved is India. India does not export vast amounts of goods to the United States. Prime Minister Modi believes, or has believed, that he was Donald Trump's friend. He had close relations with the US previously. He has led India into the arrangement known as the Quad, an arrangement with various other countries, United States, Japan, India, Australia, the so-called Quad, which, though not openly directed against China, are not exactly an alliance against China, nonetheless comes very close to being that. And yet, nonetheless, India is suddenly facing 20% tariffs. So, as I said, it's difficult to find much logic, geopolitical logic in this. Japan is also hit with tariffs above 30%, even though, again, Japan exports many goods to the United States. So is South Korea. In fact, Asian manufacturing countries have been particularly badly hit by these tariffs. So, of course, is the European Union. The European Union, lots of commentators there say, really shouldn't be struck with tariffs at all, because contrary to what the Trump administration says, overall trade between the United States and the European Union is roughly in balance. That, of course, is based on the EU importing services from the United States. As you sometimes hear acknowledged, the EU runs a significant surplus in finished goods sold to the United States. Well, for Trump, for the people around him, it is manufactured goods, finished goods, physical goods that is the issue. And here we see the European Union, supposedly America's strongest ally, it too is facing tariffs. So there isn't much geopolitical, strategical sense behind this. Allies have had tariffs slapped on them, often at higher rates than supposed rivals. It's not been overlooked, for example, that Russia has not been tariffed at all. Now, of course, the argument made by the administration is that this is because Russia is already so heavily sanctioned and the United States isn't imposing tariffs on the countries that it's sanctioned. So Russia hasn't been tariffed, neither has North Korea, neither has Iran, nor has Cuba. All true. And perhaps the reason why it was not done, why tariffs weren't imposed on these countries and specifically on Russia. But notwithstanding what people are saying, Russia does actually trade with the United States. It does actually run a trade surplus with the United States at the moment. It exports uranium, for example, to the United States. Its trade with the United States, though running at only a tenth of the levels of what it did before 2022, when the big sanctions were imposed. Nonetheless, it actually trades with the United States to a much greater extent than many other small countries and smaller economies, often poorer countries and poorer economies, which have been subjected to very severe sanctions. So one can't say that this is all based upon some great geopolitical, strategical plan. It seems to me that a quality of Donald Trump's, one that very few people seem to understand, is that generally speaking, in general terms, he means what he says. When he talks about tariffs, and he's been talking about tariffs for years, since before he became president, going all the way back to the 80s, he tends to believe in what he says, and that he is overwhelmingly, single-mindedly focused on his own understanding of American interests. He sees things purely in those terms, through that framework. Now, that doesn't mean that he's right. I mean, he may be completely wrong that tariffs are the right way for the United States. In fact, I personally think that certainly the way these tariffs have been introduced, it's almost inevitable that in time they're going to have very negative consequences. But what I'm talking about is what Trump's motives and his intentions are. His motives are what he believes he is trying to do is protect the American heartland, rebuild it, reconstitute America's manufacturing, industrial, technological leadership. And he does what many people in that kind of position do. He reaches back to the past. He looks at how the US economy was run in the period of its glory, when its growth rates were at their fastest, when material standards of living were rising, when the United States achieved its position of economic preeminence. And he sees that in those days, those glory days before the First World War, the days when William McKinley was president, others like him were president, the United States had tariffs and pursued policies of protection and sought to protect and build up its domestic industries. And he says, well, it worked then, so let's try it now. If it worked then, it will work again for us today. And you very often find people think and act in that way. And that, I think, is why he has taken this particular course. Lincoln was in favor of protection. McKinley was in favor of protection. As a result of decisions made during their presidencies, as a result of events that took place during their presidencies, the United States' economy grew and grew fast and dynamically. So if protection worked for Lincoln and McKinley, why shouldn't it work for Donald Trump? And since it is about growing the United States, making the economy strong and vital and vigorous again, well, that's why we impose sanctions in the way we do. We target our industrial competitors. We don't target those who are not our industrial competitors. And if some of those competitors are our allies, well, so be it. And if some of those countries that are adversarial to us are not competing with us economically, well, we don't impose tariffs upon them because there is no need to. In other words, I'm convinced that in Trump's own mind, this policy has a purely economic justification. Now, of course, things will follow from this, both economic and geopolitical. Countries that are subjected to these tariffs are going to be affected by them. But of course, it's the bigger message about what it says about the United States and where it is going that is going to hit home. Because what Trump has done, and notice there is very little opposition in the United States, political opposition, to what he is doing. What Trump has done essentially says that globalization, the economic system that developed principally after the Cold War, the system which envisaged a single global economic world, an interconnected economic world, regulated by instruments like the World Trade Organization. The system which, by the way, gave rise to the expression, the rules-based international order. The expression arose out of the system of trade, if it can be called trade, the globalized system that developed after the Cold War, where the rules would be set by the United States in terms of economic policy and trade, the United States and its friends, via entities like the World Trade Organization. Well, all of that, Donald Trump has said it's over. Globalization didn't work, or at least it didn't work for the United States. It didn't work for the American people. During the period of globalization, the heartland of the United States was economically hollowed out, and therefore we're turning our backs on all of that. We are no longer part of a globalized world economy. Tariffs, obviously, by definition, go totally against that. Notice that no one is talking about the World Trade Organization anymore. I presume it still exists, but as far as I'm aware, nobody is discussing what it is doing. It has, as far as I can see, suddenly been declared obsolete, because if the United States pulls out of the globalized system of the world economy, then I can't see what role any longer institutions like the World Trade Organization have. And, well, an economic turning away inevitably must also mean a geopolitical turning away as well, because the two go together. The reason why there was a globalized economy was because the United States appeared to have won the Cold War. We were in the heyday of the unipolar moment. We had books being published telling us that we'd come to the end of history and that we'd finally reached that perfect state when all of the fundamental and essential problems had been solved. All of these things came together: globalization in economics, unipolarity in terms of the United States, the preeminence of neoliberal, or if you like, liberal values. All of that was a single package. And you can't pull out of one without the whole thing coming tumbling down. So if this sticks, and I think all the chances are that it will, despite the economic turbulence that this is bound to cause, I think that many people in the United States, even if they're unhappy with the immediate effects of these tariff policies, will not support removal of these tariffs, will not support a return to economic globalization. If this sticks, which, as I said, I expect it will, then inevitably the whole concept of unipolarity, all of that, dies with it. And we are in a completely different system, one which has already been signaled by people like Marco Rubio and others, one in which the United States is just one great power in a multipolar system in which there are several. A completely different world to the one that existed before. Now, there's an awful lot more that can be said about this whole situation. First of all, I think that there is at least an argument that these tariffs are unconstitutional. I don't know whether there will be any legal challenges to them. So far, Congress seems to be showing no sign of pushing back on these tariffs. I suspect that even many Democrats know that doing so will be unpopular with many of their voters. But, the possibility that there might be legal challenges in the future remains. I cannot myself see the structures that exist in Europe, the European Union, for example, at least in its existing form, surviving the end of globalization and all that that entails. The European Union is a product of the globalized neoliberal world that emerged in the 1990s. That is why it has been so fervid in defending it. I can't imagine that it can survive all of this. And, of course, around the world, we will see alliances shift and change and policies changed as the Americans give up on their great plans and strategies of expanding a globalized neoliberal system and start behaving like a more conventional great power again. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, that the United States is going to disengage from the world. It doesn't mean that the United States is going to give up its power. What it means is that its intentions, its approach to questions of power is going to be different from what we have recently known. So anyway, there it is. An important day. A day which I think will mark a great change. But of course, its final end point we are not able to see. Anyway, where does this leave the various big questions that remain outstanding in the world now? Well, let's turn to the first one, which is the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And here I'm going to say that we have an extraordinary, almost schizophrenic approach to the Ukrainian conflict from the United States, from the Trump administration specifically. At one level, we see the United States, General Kellogg, Mike Waltz, people like that, they still talking about supporting Ukraine. Marco Rubio has just attended a NATO summit. He said that it's completely wrong to say that the United States is not supporting NATO anymore. The United States continues to supply arms to Ukraine. It continues to share intelligence with Ukraine. It is still trying to get the Russians to agree to an unconditional ceasefire which would work for Ukraine's benefit and which, were it ever to happen, would be used by the British and the French, by Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer, to send European troops to Ukraine. Now, the latest word on this, by the way, is that not only would they be sending troops to Ukraine, but there would indeed be attempts to establish Western policed no-fly zones over central and western Ukraine, and also that NATO assets, intelligence assets, would be used to enforce the ceasefire. The Russians have been talking about this. They have been saying that all of this points to the real intentions behind the entire ceasefire plan and the various moves that the Europeans are taking. Ryabkov has said that the Europeans are deliberately sabotaging all attempts to achieve a genuine peace in Ukraine. And I think it was the foreign ministry spokesman in Moscow who said that this force that the Europeans are proposing to send to Ukraine is increasingly taking on the appearance not just of a war-fighting force, but of an occupation force as well. Anyway, one faction in the administration, and I'm going to guess Mike Waltz, Keith Kellogg, seem keen on moving forward with this plan. They're trying to get the Russians to agree to this unconditional ceasefire. There's pressure in Congress to impose even more tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil. 500% tariffs. The Russians, by the way, are ridiculing this. They're saying, why stop at 500% tariffs? Why not 1,000 or 10,000% tariffs? Anyway, massive tariffs on countries that continue to buy Russian oil. There's moves in Congress to do this. There's chatter about this in the media. The British media is pushing these plans, and so, of course, are the European governments. And I have no doubt at all that there is a faction within the administration that is also keen to move in this direction as well. There does appear to be another faction also. And perhaps the key figure here is Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy. Steve Witkoff, of course, is the only Trump administration official, if he is actually even an official. But anyway, is the only person who is connected to the Trump administration, who has actually met and spoken directly with Vladimir Putin. I mean, in a physical meeting, not just over the phone, in a physical meeting, since Donald Trump took office. Marco Rubio has still not been to Moscow, nor has Keith Kellogg, even though for a time he was supposed to be Trump's peace envoy, nor has Mike Waltz. Waltz, Rubio have had telephone calls with their opposite numbers. In Moscow, Rubio has spoken several times now to Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. Waltz apparently speaks quite regularly with Putin's envoy, Putin's aide, rather, foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. But notice that neither Waltz nor Rubio have been to Moscow. Contrast that with Wang Yi, Xi Jinping's foreign minister, China's foreign minister, and Xi Jinping's national security advisor, who is currently in Moscow and who has just had a long meeting with Putin and Lavrov, which I discussed in my program yesterday. So up to this moment, Witkoff is the only member of the Trump team who's actually had a one-to-one personal meeting with Putin, who's actually gone to Moscow, gone to the Kremlin, met with Putin there. And one gets the sense that Witkoff has a completely different sense of this whole situation than Waltz and Kellogg and perhaps Rubio as well. And I suspect that Kellogg is not alone, by the way. My guess is that there are other members of the administration who are more in tune with his thinking. And in my opinion, Witkoff sees this much more in the president's terms. Just as Trump has imposed these sanctions, which are focused on Trump's ideas of America's economic self-interest. I think Witkoff basically thinks the same way. He's a businessman, a New York businessman, like Donald Trump. They know each other, they're friends with each other, they've had many dealings with each other, and I think he shares the same perspectives and transactional opinions as Trump does. And what he wants to do is he wants to get the whole problem of Ukraine out of the way as soon as possible, because he sees Russia as this massive business opportunity. And one can understand why. Because Russia is not an industrial manufacturing competitor with the United States. It doesn't export the kind of goods that the United States tries or seeks to export. It doesn't export civil aircraft, for example, or motor vehicles. Trump is very, very concerned about the fact that Europeans don't buy American cars, for example. Anyway, Russia is not a country that is selling large numbers of cars, has ever sold huge numbers of cars to the United States. It's never sold aircraft to the United States in any quantity. There are many reasons for this, by the way, which I'm not going to go into. I did speak previously about how the United States also finds ways of not importing products that are not subject to tariffs from countries that it sees as rivals. I'm not going to discuss this where Russia is concerned. But anyway, for Trump and Witkoff, Russia is this huge country which produces lots of things that America might want to have. Food. And of course, the United States does have a large farming sector, and American farmers who tend to vote for Donald Trump probably aren't keen on huge exports or imports of Russian grain and foodstuffs, but they probably like the fertilizer that Russia produces. And Trump also has the imperative in a time of inflationary stress, and the tariffs are going to increase inflation in the United States, where inflationary pressures have already been growing. Anyway, Trump will want to keep food prices stable or even push them down lower in the United States. After all, it's only a few weeks ago that there was a huge issue in the United States about the shortages and the cost of eggs, for example. Now, I'm not suggesting that Russia is going to export vast numbers of eggs to the United States. By the way, there have been problems with egg prices in Russia too over the last few months. Just saying. But anyway, the point is that the price of food is something that Trump no doubt is concerned about, even as prices for cars and other finished goods increase because of the tariffs. He probably wants those prices to remain stable as well. And he also undoubtedly has particular perspectives about energy prices. And this is something, by the way, that Putin grasped almost immediately, and which Putin set out in the letter he sent to Trump shortly after Trump was elected. Putin pointed out that Russia, like the United States, is a huge continental country. Russia, like the United States, has a significant manufacturing and industrial base. Russia, like the United States, is a major producer of oil and gas and energy altogether. And Putin made the point to Trump in that letter that just as the United States needs a balance in energy prices, it doesn't want energy prices to go so high that it starts to create problems, cost problems for industry. Likewise, the United States and Russia don't want energy prices to fall so low that de-incentivizes investment in the energy sector, in oil, gas, oil exploration, and that kind of thing. So Putin said, look, we have a commonality of views here. Let's get together and talk about this, and let's see whether we can come to some kind of consensus. And the Russians, of course, have many other things. They have uranium, which they still export to the United States. They have titanium, which is important for American aircraft. They have lots of other strategic materials as well. They're major producers of aluminium, for example. They are also a country with enormous resources in terms of rare earths, very important for manufacturing all kinds of products. So, in theory, there is a possible commonality of American and Russian interests. A relationship could be forged, and it would not be a rivalrous relationship in the way that, say, the economic relationship between the United States and Germany and the United States and China has been. Because up to now, Russia has not competed head-to-head with the United States in exports of manufactured goods. Now, before I continue, I'm going to say that this may change. There is a significant manufacturing boom underway in Russia at the moment. The Russians have a major program for developing their semiconductor AI programs. I've been reading lots of articles now and interviews by people in Russia, for example, discussing how to expand Russia's domestic chips industry. Much more structured plans than those that the Biden administration had. Russia is making also big moves to rebuild its civil aviation sector. The new MS-21 with new engines, PD-14 engines, is likely to start flying before long. It will probably be entering production as early as next year. The Sukhoi Superjet, a new version of the Sukhoi Superjet, redesigned by the Yakovlev Bureau, with all the French technology and French engines deleted, completely redesigned, and by the way, to the point of it being practically a new aircraft with new PD-8 engines. It's now been tested and demonstrated, and again, serial production is supposed to start next year. The Russians have also developed helicopter engines for helicopters that are expected to fill niches previously filled within Russia by Western helicopters. These are the sort of smaller helicopters. The Russians already are self-sufficient in the bigger helicopters they already make. Anyway, there's an awful lot of that going on, and that Russia also has a car industry and a locomotive industry and all those sort of things. So this American assumption that Russia is really a producer of raw materials and food and oil and all of that might not remain true for very, very long. But it is the perception, I think, many people in the Trump administration still have of Russia. And as I said, one can see the commonality of interest. And that is, I think, what people like Witkoff want to build on. And that is why a Russian official, Kirill Dmitriev, is now in the United States He was sanctioned, and the United States had to relax the sanctions on him to grant him a visa. And Dmitriev is now in Washington. He's arrived in Washington, and he has been having meetings with Witkoff, supposedly in the White House itself, which, by the way, opens up the opportunity for Trump to come in and meet Dmitriev, who speaks, by the way, fluent English. He was partly educated in the United States, even though Dmitriev is said to be very close to Putin. Anyway, it opens up the possibility that Trump could meet with Dmitriev as well. Now, Dmitriev is not a diplomat. He is not a member of the Russian Foreign Ministry. In fact, probably speaking, he's not even a member of the Russian government. He is the chair of Russia's Direct Investment Fund. This is a funding vehicle supposed to attract foreign investors who want to invest their money in the Russian economy. And the countries which Dmitriev has until recently given the greatest attention to are the Gulf Arab states, where he has been a regular visitor and where he has had a certain amount of success in persuading the Gulf states to invest through the Direct Investment Fund in Russia's economy. Just saying. So he is a trade and economy official. He's not somebody who deals with political and geostrategic questions. But he is meeting with Witkoff, and he's meeting in the White House, apparently, and he's going to be talking to Witkoff and who knows which other officials, maybe even Donald Trump himself for 1, perhaps 2 days, conceivably even longer. And I can't help but think that what is being set up here is first a dialogue about moving forward with economic cooperation, because Donald Trump, just as he wants the American people to have cheap food to keep inflation low, he also wants lower prices for energy. He doesn't want energy prices to take off, as they conceivably could do, which would put more pressure on American household budgets. He knows perfectly well what that did to Joe Biden. Anyway, he's got a good reason to speak with Dmitriev and to establish contacts with him. But there is something else as well, because with this administration, with Donald Trump, it seems to me that economics and trade ultimately determine policy. And an arrangement between Witkoff, who is someone Donald Trump trusts, and Dmitriev has another look about it as well. It looks to me like a Backchannel. Now, here a little bit of history is needed, because the United States and Russia, the United States and the Soviet Union, often had occasions to negotiate with each other during the Cold War. And what would regularly happen, frequently happen, was that US officials would meet with Russian officials in very formal settings. In Helsinki or Vienna, they would discuss strategic arms limitation or things like that. But that much of the actual discussion, the real negotiations, the places where the breakthroughs were made, often used to take place through back channels. And I'll give a few examples. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, when the United States and the Soviet Union were facing off against each other, and there seemed to be a very real prospect and danger of nuclear war. There were the regular contacts between the American and Soviet governments. But the real negotiations which were taking place, even as Khrushchev and Kennedy were exchanging long letters with each other, but the real contacts, the major discussions were taking place through a back channel, through President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, who is the Attorney General, and the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin. And it was through the Dobrynin-Kennedy, Robert Kennedy back channel that the deal which diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis was negotiated and brought into effect. Now, something very similar happened later during the SALT negotiations, the negotiations between the Nixon administration and the Soviet Union to agree reductions on strategic weapons. There was, again, negotiations, formal negotiations between negotiating teams taking place in Helsinki. I remember the lead American negotiator, a man called Gerald Smith, and I remember how very highly respected he was. Very tough, very capable negotiator. But alongside those negotiations, the big formal negotiations in Helsinki, there was a back channel. And the back channel this time was between Henry Kissinger, who was Richard Nixon's national security advisor, and the Soviet ambassador to Washington, who, by the way, was still Anatoly Dobrynin, the same man who had previously run the back channel with Robert Kennedy all the way back in the early 1960s. Anyway, again, it was very much through the discussions between Kissinger and Dobrynin, through the back channel, that the major breakthroughs that led to the SALT I Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty were negotiated. And Kissinger also had another back channel, though this was a more public one. This was in the talks between the North Vietnamese and the Americans to find some means to extricate the United States from the Vietnam War. There were the formal negotiations that took place in Paris. I remember that the head of the North Vietnamese negotiating team was a former North Vietnamese foreign minister. I don't remember his name. But the real negotiations, again, took place via a back channel. And the back channel was between Henry Kissinger again, Richard Nixon's national security advisor, and a senior member of North Vietnam's Politburo, Le Duc Tho. So, back channels are far from new in American diplomacy. And I have to say that the Witkoff Dmitriev conversations do have something of that look about them. Witkoff and Dmitriev clearly get on. Apparently, Witkoff was very taken by Dmitriev when they met as part of the negotiations which took place in Riyadh. They both have business backgrounds. Dmitriev, as I said, speaks fluent English and has been partly educated in the United States. He is totally loyal, by all accounts, to Putin, and I'm sure shares most of Putin's perspectives on international affairs. He is, by all accounts, a tough and clever man and an extremely capable negotiator. So here we have a setup Witkoff and Dmitriev, they meet in Washington. They're likely to meet in other places as well. I have to say, this looks like the making of a back channel to me. Now, where does this leave us? Well, the United States, with Liberation Day, seems to be, as I said, turning its back on the kind of hegemonic policies that it sought to follow. I've already discussed in many places how the United States wants to refocus on China. Its strategic priority is on China, contesting China in the Asia Pacific, not in Russia in Europe. Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, has apparently made a decision that he is not going to attend the next contact group meeting between the Ukrainians and the Europeans, the Western powers, to discuss the continued military support to Ukraine. The US Defense Secretary, in other words, by his absence, is signaling that Ukraine is being given much less priority. So, with all of this going on, with the United States turning back a bit on itself, not giving up its status as a great power or anything of that kind, but changing its economic orientation, and inevitably as a result, its foreign policy orientation. The two go together, with the focus being first and foremost on economic self-interest. Here we have two men, Dmitriev and Witkoff, each talking each other's, each understanding each other on these matters. Witkoff quite openly signaling that as far as he's concerned, if the deal that's done with the Russians is Istanbul Plus, he at least has no objection to it. Well, isn't this perhaps where the real negotiation is taking place? The Americans and the Russians might meet again in Riyadh, Waltz and Ushakov and all of the others. We know there's going to be further discussions in Istanbul, but it is Dmitriev and Witkoff who, even as they discuss various ideas for economic cooperation, are going to say, well, look, let's get this business of Ukraine out of the way, and let's do it by just moving forward with Istanbul Plus. Now, in a program we did with him on the Duran, Glenn Deason and myself, Professor Mearsheimer made what I thought was an extremely astute point, that the reason Witkoff has been parachuted by Trump into the center of the negotiations is precisely because Trump trusts Witkoff and doesn't trust any of his other potential negotiators. He doesn't fully trust Rubio. He doesn't fully trust Waltz, at least not on this issue of Ukraine. And that, I think, is almost certainly true. And it also points to the real negotiation happening between Witkoff and Dmitriev, this being the back channel between Putin and Trump. This is where the real deals and discussions are going to be made. Anyway, these are extraordinary times. It's not very easy sometimes to decipher what is happening, and Trump himself is often pulled in all kinds of different directions. So the hardliners are still there. Lindsey Graham is pushing forward with his bone-crunching sanctions against the Russians, the 500% tariffs on countries that dare to buy Russian oil, all that kind of thing. But even as all of that rhetoric, all of those signals happen, Witkoff and Dmitriev meet, and I can't help but think that it is with that meeting that Trump's real convictions lie. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, I think it's worth saying now a few things about the military situation on the battlefronts, because one of the things that's happened over the last couple of weeks is that some people in the West have revived the stalemate narrative about the war, the claim that the war is somehow in deadlock, that's why the Russians need to concede a ceasefire because they can't keep fighting anymore. Their army is almost exhausted. Their economy is under unbearable stress. It's impossible for them to keep fighting. So that's why they need to accept the ceasefire, even if that means British and French troops and Western fighter jets patrolling Ukraine and all that kind of thing. So that narrative has returned. It always happens when the Russians are advancing, as they were through the summer and autumn and winter of 2024. There was panic, there was dismay, there was hand-wringing, there was demands to launch missiles deep inside Russia itself, all of that. Then, when the spring thaw comes, when movements on the battlefronts slow, when the Russians rest and reorganize their army and re-equip their army, well, that then swings us back to the stalemate narrative. It is as false now as when it has been peddled before. It has no reality or substance behind it. I read a report recently which spoke about how the Russians have captured less territory in Ukraine in March than they did in February, and that they captured less territory in February than they did in January. This entirely ignores the fact that the major Russian advance in March was not in Ukraine at all, but actually inside Russia, where the Russians basically ended Ukraine's Kursk offensive. They squelched the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk, dealing the biggest blow on Ukraine and its military that it has ever experienced in the war up to now. It is astonishing to me how incredibly selective people still remain in the West about how they report this war. So let's just quickly look at what the military situation is like. Well, Group of Forces North is now saying that Guyevo is being cleared, that the rest of Kursk region is about to be cleared. Well, they've been saying this for some time, but they've been getting more metrics about where they are. And it does now look as if this small sliver of territory in Kursk region that the Ukrainians have been clinging on to has basically been reduced now to just a few dozen square kilometers of territory, which will be cleared, I suspect, by the Russians fairly quickly. The Russians have now established a significant bridgehead in Sumy region in Ukraine, though it's difficult to get an exact sense of where the Russians are, because, to say it straightforwardly, I get the sense that many of the Russian reporting channels have not yet established contacts with the soldiers who are there. Also, Group of Forces North seems to exercise a particularly tight grip on information control, more so than other Russian military formations, groups of forces. It does that even as it has its own really rather active Telegram channel that, as I said, I've talked about quite often. Group of Forces North is also saying that the Ukrainian incursion or attempted incursion into Belgorod region has basically run out of steam. The Ukrainians failed to capture the villages of Demidovka and Popovka. They captured a few buildings in Demidovka, but they're only just about able to cling on to them. They briefly entered Popovka, but that has now been cleared. The Group of Forces North say that Ukrainian attacks in this area seem to have petered out. The Ukrainians are trying to dig in, controlling the few tree lines and fields and things like that they have. But Group of Forces North seems to expect that they will be driven out of these places fairly quickly. And I'm sure that is right, by the way. This attempted incursion into Belgorod was another diversion of men and resources in order to try to cover up for the disaster in Kiev, and it has achieved nothing. Now, further south, the Russians have apparently established a very big and powerful bridgehead in northern Kharkiv region. They're now said to be just 3 kilometers north of Kupiansk on the western bank of the Oskol River. There's suggestions that they might start pushing towards Kupiansk fairly soon. We shall see. But there are reports, including from the Institute of the Study of War, that the biggest push by the Russians is going to come further south, and that the Russians have now established a significant and very powerful force at the southern end of the Zherebets River, and that this force is capable of pushing on to Liman and perhaps Izium, behind west of Kupiansk, and could also presumably cut off the Ukrainian troops in Siversk. According to the Institute of the Study of War, the Russian troops in this area now outnumber the Ukrainians by a factor of 10 to 1. Whether that is really the case or not, of course, I'm not in any position to say. But that is what the Russians are saying, or rather what the Institute of the Study of War is saying. Anyway, further to the south and west, the Ukrainian counterattacks in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar appear to have ended, at least for the moment. As I spoke in my program yesterday, an article in the London Times appeared to be preparing the ground for a Ukrainian acknowledgement that Toretsk is about to pass, or has passed, fully under Russian control. Radovka yesterday, this is the Russian newspaper, had a long piece about how the Russian priority in this area at the moment is to capture various villages like Alexandropil and others to the west of Toretsk, basically to cut off the Ukrainian grouping that continues to exist around Toretsk itself, to cut off its supply lines and to create another potential pincer for an advance on the town of Konstantinovka to the south of Kramatorsk. And, well, the most dramatic news over the last couple of hours continues to come from the south. the Russians have captured the village of Lobovka in Zaporozhye region, which puts them, from what I can see on the map, close to advancing on Orechov, which was Zaporozhye. And they have also captured a village called Veselye, which lies to the south of Novopavlovka. And Russian and Ukrainian reports are now openly saying that the entire Ukrainian defense lines, the entire Ukrainian position west of the Dnieper is about to collapse completely, that the Ukrainian Khortytsa group is beginning to lose its coherence. All the major fortified positions have been taken or are in the process of being taken. If a village called Komar and another bigger village, Novopavlovka, fall, there really are no obstacles and no properly organized formations left to prevent the Russians advancing westwards to the river. It's perhaps also worth pointing out that if these places, not Komar and Novopavlovka, also fall, the Russians will be located significantly to the west of Pokrovsk, which lies to the north. And if they choose to advance northwards, which they could also do, they would be in a strong position to cut completely Ukrainian communications to Pokrovsk and ultimately to encircle that town. Now, all of this is for the future. There is this drumbeat of information about a Russian offensive being prepared in late April, May. Reports of major troop build-up around the town of Selidovo, which the Russians captured a few months ago, south of Pokrovsk. Well, all of this, as I said, it seems to me is being prepared. There's also, I've heard reports that the Russians are also clearing the roads, sorting out the roads, building netting over the roads to protect the roads from drones, repairing the railway lines which have been captured from the Ukrainians, many of which are in states of disrepair. That all of that is now going on and is happening at speed. Well, we shall see. But certainly, I don't think there's any sort of stalemate in the conflict. A Russian journalist, Fyodor Lukyanov, put it this way. He said, why should we agree to a ceasefire? We are winning the war. We are not in any hurry. Even if we are winning slowly, the fact is we are winning. And he is absolutely right. And if the talks between Dmitriev and Witkoff are a sign of where things are going, if Pete Hegseth's decision to stay away from the whole contact group is a further sign of where things are going, if the tariffs, the big tariff announcement that Trump has made, also point in any particular direction, they all seem to me to point in the same direction, to America, or at least the Trump administration, trying gradually, quietly, to extricate the United States from the war. Well, this is where I finish my program today. Tomorrow, I suspect I'll be talking a little bit more detail about the military affairs, but also maybe about whatever diplomacy is taking place and discussing the Russian point of view of things. But anyway, Trump has dominated again, as he often does, the last 24 hours. He's come in for a huge amount of criticism, which I think, by the way, at some level, he even welcomes. But anyway, That's my program for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.